to the final of the first Herbert Freehills Moot, in which I and our panel up here represent the Court of Justice of the European Union, hearing arguments in the case between the Ruritanian Competition Authority and the Association of Ruritanian wind power equipment producers. I believe representing the Competition Authority is El Arian team, and representing the wind turbine producers is the Alvarez team. We have a timekeeper, I believe, who will be keeping an eye on time and keeping you notified. I think that completes the housekeeping, and I would be grateful if Ariane could kick off with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam President, honored members of the Court, distinguished colleagues, my name is Jory Gevouw and I will be presenting the opinion of the claimant in this case, the views of the claimants in this case regarding the first and second preliminary question. My learned colleague Natalie McNabb will present the views of the claimants regarding the third and the fourth preliminary question. In 2012, the defendants agreed to limit the output of certain types of wind turbines, which covered 90% of the market. This agreement, typified by the claimant as being a restriction by object, brings us before the court today. The claimant seeks to address the court on the following issues. First of all, the objective of the agreement. Second of all, the government support. Thirdly, the presumption of incompatibility. And fourthly, the efficiencies. To start with the objective of the agreement of increased innovation and more environmentally friendly products doesn't change the fact that this agreement can be found to be a restriction by object. At the outset, it should be noted that as a general principle of competition law, undertakings must independently determine their market conduct, as the court has stated in the Beef Industry Development Society case. In this case, the agreement, the undertakings, had concerted practice in order to install output limitations on the Ruritanian market on the area of wind turbines. Output limitations are generally regarded by the court as being object restrictions. For example, in the case of Beef Industry Society, European Night Services, Cartman Care, and also in the Commission guidelines, this is stated. The determination of whether an agreement is an object restriction contains of four elements. First of all, the objective of the agreement, which is in this case more innovation and more environmentally friendly products. This is never mentioned by the court as being a legitimate objective. The claimant contends that even if the court decides this to be a legitimate objective, still this is not enough to find an object restriction in this case, as the court has stated in General Motors versus Commission. Second of all, there is clearly anti-competitive conduct. The intent of the parties is clear, they want to restrict output and raise prices. And last of all, the economic and legal context shows that the agreement in question raises prices on the market and limits the choice for consumers. Furthermore, this agreement raises high entry barriers on the Ruritanian wind turbine market, since those are by nature complex products, which is also, and the high entry barriers are even higher because of the quality and size standards that the Ruritanian wind turbine manufacturers installed. Furthermore, there was, before the agreement was concluded, there was fierce competition on the Ruritanian market, which is now completely eliminated. All in all, the claimant contends that this agreement should be founded to be a restriction by object.
Can I interrupt and ask you how you would think that that conclusion squares up with the latest findings of recent court decisions in, for example, Herbert, which say that in considering whether you have a restriction by object, regard must be had not to the context of objectives, apparently without limitation, an economic and legal context. You have addressed what seems to be the preceding case, or could you tell me how you approach that case?
Thank you, Your Ladyship. The agreements that I mentioned are actually from, as far as the claimant is concerned, from carte bancaire. First of all, the objective of the agreement. Second of all, the content of the agreement. Thirdly, the intent, which is not a necessary requirement, but which could be taken into account. And fourthly, the economic and legal context of the agreement.
You mentioned in discussing what aspect of the legal and economic context are you taking into account? Because you seem to be mentioning changes to the competitive situation in Britannia, but without any reference to why they're happening. Is not that part of the context?
Thank you, Your Ladyship. Indeed, economic and legal circumstances of this case are relevant, and as I mentioned, those agreements limit consumer choice and lead to high price, which is, of course, not a well, as I explained, there was, before the agreement, there was fierce competition, which is because of the agreement, which covers 90% of the market, has completely eliminated. And I also pointed out the fact that those wind turbines are complex, innovative products. Is that the answer you're looking for, Your Ladyship?
Well, it's the answer you've given me, and I can only take it so far, but it does seem to me that there were some government interventions which would clearly have had an effect on the market, and they haven't been mentioned at all. Presumably we'll be coming up to that as it's a separate or the first question. So you could address that.
Thank you, Your Ladyship. Indeed, there have been government interventions. For example, the government has encouraged the Ruritanian wind turbine manufacturers to innovate more, and they threatened to legislate in this regard. This is part of the second element of this pleading, which is the extent to which the government support exempts this agreement from Article 1011 of the treaty. And if I may continue with that part of the pleading.
Could I, before you move to the government involvement point, could I ask, let's suppose that the restriction in question, as you say, does reduce output, unmistakably a reduction of output. Let's also assume that it results or is likely to result in an improvement in quality. Does the improvement in quality serve any purpose in determining whether this is an object offense?
Thank you, Your Lordship. This doesn't change the fact that an object restriction can be found, since this specific issue should be determined under Article 101(3).
So an improvement in quality is irrelevant to a threshold decision about the application of 1011.
The claimant believes so.
So you would argue that no magnitude of quality improvement would cause a different result on the 101 analysis. Even assume with me for a second, it's a dramatic improvement in quality. So price might well go up, but quality is going to go up dramatically too. You're saying that the quality effects are irrelevant.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, under Article 111, the object infringement is indeed irrelevant, since object restrictions are by nature restrictive for competition, and the positive effects of this agreement should be assessed under Article 113 of the treaty.
So nothing I can say about quality is going to get me out of the 1011 bullseye.
Well, the claimant believes so.
I was just going to say, just to follow up on that line of thought, how does your comment square with the observation of Advocate General Wahl in Carte Bancaire, where he said that object assessment is conceivable only in the case of conduct entailing an inherent risk of a particularly serious harmful effect, or conduct in respect to which it can be concluded that the unfavourable effects on competition outweigh the pro-competitive effects. So isn't he there allowing some consideration of the quality, pro-competitive quality effects in the assessment of object classification?
Thank you, Your Lordship. As far as the claimant is concerned, the positive effects that an agreement has should be taken into account under Article 113. The claimant believes that the Carte Bancaire case, the object category was narrowed, but in this case, these are output limitations, and those are established by the court, and also the criteria I mentioned, those are established as being restrictions by competition by object. And still the smaller scope of Article 101 of the object restriction as established in Carte Bancaire, according to the claimant, still leaves enough room for output limitations to be.
So you are effectively saying that the form of the restriction trumps any consideration of other aspects, even though if it had been an agreement in a less obvious form, not a form which had previously been held, could be equally objectively damaging, but if a form which had not previously been considered, you would think you should look at the surrounding circumstances to assess it. Is that what you're saying?
Thank you, Your Ladyship. I think I just referred to positive benefits under Article 101, which I believe, or the claimant believes, might be something else than the economic and legal context. But a preliminary question, the claimant wants to request 5 minutes more time in order to finish the pleadings. If Your Ladyship allows me, I want to continue to the second part of the preliminary question.
One question, yeah.
Yes,
This is a more general question about the interpretation of Article 101. We know that we have this list of examples in that article, and you refer to subparagraph B. Do you interpret this provision in the way that if a cartel or agreement is mentioned in that list, we know that the list is not exhaustive, but if the agreement is mentioned in that list, so there is a kind of prima facie presumption that the agreement falls under the criteria prevention or restriction of competition by object. Or do you think that this list is does not there is no the provision cannot be interpreted in that way, that it's either either by object or by effect? What is your understanding? How should we understand and read the provision?
Thank you, Your Lordship. as I understand if I understand the question correctly, you're asking whether the mere fact that those output limitations are mentioned by the court are enough to establish object restriction.
Yeah.
Well, according to the claimant, they aren't. They're mere examples of other cases where an output limitation were established to be object restrictions. And in order to establish object restriction in this case, regard should be had to the 4 criteria, which I mentioned before and I mentioned in Code Bancaire. Thank you. To proceed to the government support, undertakings do only escape liability for government support is if any competitive activity is made impossible. That's the case established that in Deutsche Telekom. In this case, the government merely encourages and threatens to legislate, which is not enough for the agreement to be exempted from the scope of Article 1011. Furthermore, object restrictions should be presumed to be incompatible with Article 1013. In theory, object restrictions should be able to fulfill those criteria. However, in practice, they do rarely fulfill those criteria. Firstly, due to the restrictive nature of those criteria, and furthermore, because of the presumption of the burden of proof of the undertaking of the defendants in this case to prove that they satisfy the criteria of Article 1013.
Counsel, if I may interrupt, you mentioned the insufficiency of government pressure in this respect, but isn't it in the fact of this problem question that due to government measures, demand of certain wind turbines has been completely extinguished?
Thank you, Your Lordship. As the court has stated in Deutsche Telekom, only if there is no possibility for the undertakings to undertake competitive activity, that is enough to exempt the agreement from the scope of Article 1011. The claimant believes that in this case there is still room for competitive activity by the Ruritanian wind turbine manufacturers.
You cite the Deutsche Telekom case, and there are others about cases where there's a margin of manoeuvre left to the companies, then they should exploit that and should compete. But here, is it not the case that we don't have it's not that the government didn't allow margin of manoeuvre, but it pointed you in a particular direction, pointed the defendants in a particular direction. In what way are the precedents compelling in that situation?
Thank you. Well, as far as Deutsche Telekom is concerned, if there is still room for maneuver, then there is liability by the companies, for the companies. As a preliminary issue, I want to request the court for some more time. 5 minutes?
Yes, certainly.
Thank you.
We would like to be
Okay.
ask you lots of questions.
Thank you. If I may, I want to continue with object restriction, the presumption of incompatibility of Article 1013, which I already begun to elaborate upon. In theory,
If I could ask a final point on government involvement, maybe not final. What happens if the government's entreaty to a reasonable observer puts me in peril if I don't abide by it? What if it imperils my business model, my business operations, where the speaker has made a credible threat to punish me in a severe way? Need I ignore the threat in that instance? Is it irrelevant to the application of Article 1?
thank you. The claimant is not aware of any case law in that regard. However, as a more conceptual, from a more conceptual point of view, the claimant believes that depends on the penalty that is imposed by the government. If it's only a small penalty, then there's still room for competitive agreement. However, if it's a penalty which makes the competitive conduct impossible, or the conduct of undertaking impossible, then we think it's it should be well, exempted.
Council, one last intervention from my side. You mentioned the penalties. Looking at the penalties at the fines, the cartel fines of recent years, which have been quite extraordinarily high, and to some extent even deemed to be quasi-criminal. Shouldn't we take that into account?
Well, according to the claimant, the fine in this case is not known. So according to the facts of this case, the claimant, well, there is no fine. Furthermore, the criminal penalties cases in the European Union are this is a minor part. Well, it's a minor part of. Well, it's at least not relevant in this case. Thank you.
Yes, well, I still have one question about this, the involvement of the government, of the member state. What do you think if the member state, or would it be possible for a member state to impose by law, an act of parliament, the same restrictions as are in the agreement? Would that be compatible with the EU law?
Thank you, Your Lordship. Indeed, that would be compatible with EU law, since the court has stated in the case Deutsche Telekom that if the government requires that conduct, this would exempt the agreement from the scope of Article 111.
Yeah, perhaps you did not really understand I would like to precise my question, but yes, that would be perhaps the conclusion as to the in respect of in this case, but could I know that this perhaps go a little bit outside the competition law, but could the member state, could it under the European Union law, could it enact just such a law? Could it restrict the competition in that way? I know this goes a bit outside, but what is your feeling?
Thank you. Thank you, Your Lordship. So you're basically asking whether anti-competitive agreements on the area of, or anti-competitive environmental measures could be allowed if they infringe, or could be allowed if the government or if it.
Yeah. Could the member state, if the member state enacts a law saying the same as in the agreement, would such a law be compatible with EU law? Would there be an infringement by the member state?
Well, at least as far as I'm concerned, the public policy clauses in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, I believe Article 7 and Article 11, state that the environmental benefits should be the same level as competition concerns. So if the government installs those kind of measures, the claimant believes that they could redeem the anti-competitive effects, but that's of course a public policy issue that the government should decide by itself. Thank you.
I know we're going to allow you 5 minutes on the
Okay.
so on the second question.
Thank you, Your Ladyship. Let me quickly continue. Object restrictions should be presumed to be incompatible with Article 101(3) of the treaty. In Matter Hachek, the court established that object restrictions should in principle be able to fulfill those criteria. However, the claimant states that in practice this is not the case, since object restrictions do hardly fulfill the criteria of Article 101(3). Furthermore, the enforcement reality shows that under Regulation 1/2003, Article 2, it's for the undertakings to prove the benefit under Article 101(3) and therefore in practice the incompatibility is presumed, according to the claimant. Therefore, the claimant urges the court to equalize theory and practice in this regard. To continue with the second part, no benefits flow from the agreement of this restriction by object in Article 113 of the treaty. At the outset, it should be noted that anti-competitive agreements, the negative effects of anti-competitive agreements should at least balance against the positive effects that those agreements have, as the court has stated in European Night Service, for example, and also Commission guidelines state this. In this case, the limitation by output is a very severe restriction of competition. That means that the threshold for Article 113 should be high. The criteria of Article 113 are cumulative and exhaustive, and the claimant will first go to the first criteria, which is technical and economic progress. In this case, there are no direct results such as improved products or cost savings. Those agreements merely increase the revenue of the products sold at the cost of consumers. Consequently, the second criterion of consumer benefit is neither fulfilled. Furthermore, these agreements are not indispensable, since the companies could have used the tax incentives and also have used the quality and size criteria without agreeing on output limitations. Lastly, there's a competition on the Ruritanian market is largely eliminated, since the agreement covers 90% of the Ruritanian market. Therefore, the agreement in question doesn't satisfy the criteria of Article 113 of the treaty. Thank you. If you don't have any further questions.
Well, I rather wondered whether, in this context, it's actually particularly relevant what the answer is on this particular agreement, or whether the question that the court is addressing is basically, is Article 113 available, to which you have answered yes. You've then pointed out there is a burden of proof on the defendant to prove all the elements. Why is it necessary to say that there's a higher burden of proof, particularly when in an object restriction nobody has actually examined any of those elements, and obviously many object restrictions are quite as serious in operation as others are. There's been no examination of those elements at all till you come to 113. Obviously the defendants have to prove their case, but would it be right for this court to suggest that there were further hurdles for the defendants other than having to prove their case?
Thank you, Your Ladyship. It should be noted that object restrictions are restricted by nature, which the court has established in Allianz, Carpenter and others. Therefore, these restrictions have detrimental effects on competition, even though their effects are not established under the effects infringement. Nevertheless, they have severe effects on competition, which should be redeemed by Article 113 in order to fulfill the criteria of that article.
I think we're agreed. I think we're in agreement about that. But presumption, if this court were to say that there was a presumption that those criteria in some way would not be fulfilled, or that there was a higher burden of proof to be met, would that be right? Rather than simply saying that they have to prove their case.
Thank you, Your Ladyship. The claimant believes indeed that will be right. It will give the court the opportunity to equalize theory and practice in that regard. Since presumption doesn't mean that it can never be fulfilled, or it just is a better way of putting the practice into words. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
No,
Give the word on the colleague.
President, honourable members of the court, dear colleagues, the claimant's final two submissions focus on two issues. Firstly, the anti-competitive nature of the no poach and the no hire agreement, and secondly, the joint and several liability of RWP and Power. I will begin with the first issue. The no poach and the no hire agreement can be categorized into three arguments. Firstly, that it is anti-competitive in its object. Secondly, that it is anti-competitive in its effect, if the court were not to find it to be anti-competitive in its object. And thirdly, that it does not fulfill the criteria of 113. The no poach and the no hire agreement is anti-competitive in its object. While the EU has no legal precedent in this regard, an analogy can be drawn from output restrictions. Workers are an essential factor of production in a firm. The fact that they are limited in their mobility between firms indicates that it is an output restriction. In European night services, the court held that an output restriction is considered as an obvious restriction to competition, insinuating a hardcore restriction. This indicates the harmful nature of these types of agreements. Moreover, we can draw an analogy and parallels from other jurisdictions. For example, in the United States, in the case which resulted in the settlement of California versus eBay, the economist in that case, John Riddle, stated that the restrictive hiring practices reduced employee mobility, and the employees had less access to information concerning employment at other firms, and also that they were not aware of the fact that there are wages available at the other firms. When compared to our case of the Ruritanian wind turbine sales market, it is clear that the agreement aims to hinder the mobility, and that the workers were also unaware of these potential employment opportunities and the potential wage increase. Moreover, the employees are central to an employee's business, to a firm's business. The wind turbines cannot develop, cannot become more efficient without these essential factors of production. It is therefore the combination of these two, the no poach and the no hire agreement, that result in the agreement being anti-competitive in its object, and as the court has stated in Cartman Care, results in a sufficient degree of harm to competition. In the alternative, the agreement can also be considered anti-competitive in its effect. The fact that the wind turbine producers covered 90% of the market, and that they are the four main producers of wind turbines, indicates that there is little room for maneuver for them in terms of employment. The workers ultimately stand to gain from high mobility. It's an innovation market. The firms need the innovation. They need their employees to look for opportunities and develop their skills consistently. Wages become much more competitive as a result of this. However, the workers have not had the chance to benefit from these agreements, from their high mobility opportunities.
Are employee interests and interests we should be concerned to protect under Article 101?
Thank you for your question, Your Lordship. Employment has been considered in the Metro case under 113 as a relevant factor. Under 101, we're primarily looking at either the object or the effect of the agreement. Now, the employees here certainly are certainly relevant in that matter, as they are the ones directly affected by this agreement.
What do you see to be, along the lines of my colleague's question, the harm to consumers?
Thank you for your question, Your Lordship. While the agreement primarily negatively affects the employees, there's certainly an aspect of it that also affects the consumers themselves. The firms are competing for labour in the sense that they want to produce the best products. They want to be the most competitive firms in the market. The fact that they have essentially limited their labour and have fixed prices in a sense that they cannot be more competitive results in the fact that the products they produce cannot be more efficient, and they won't be as competitive as they could be. In that sense, consumers do not benefit from better products.
The development of object defenses has proceeded through a gradual iteration of decision-making where courts accumulate experience with practices before drawing harsh conclusions. Why should we depart from that approach here, where the precedent, previous experience seems to be so limited?
If I understand your question correctly, you are insinuating the fact that the EU has no legal precedent in this regard, and where to draw the.
If I recall, the courts have not seen this practice, nor even in the United States did the matter result in a judicial decision. Shouldn't courts be somewhat cautious before deciding what goes into the object category?
Counsel, just to clarify my colleague's question, given the lack of experience with this matter, with non-poaching agreements under EU law, shouldn't we give the benefit of the doubt, consider the benefit of the doubt and consider it as a restriction by effect rather than restriction by object?
Thank you for your question, Your Lordship. This matter is certainly one crossing boundaries. The EU has not dealt with the no-poach agreement before. However, there is a long history of precedent concerning output restrictions. There is certainly an analogy that can be drawn here. We are all well aware of the fact that the employees are crucial to a firm. Now, while it may be the case, if the court were to be hesitant in concerning it as an object restriction, the claimants concede that it could be considered as under an effects agreement as well. The arguments considering an effects agreement are so overwhelming here that it should qualify under 101 either way.
Are there EU precedents which deal with restrictions of competition on input markets rather than output markets?
Thank you for your question, Your Ladyship. This is certainly an issue that the claimants have considered as well. It's the no hiring part of the agreement here that could be considered an input foreclosure in that regard. The firms are essentially agreeing to, one, not poach the other employees, but also if the employees were to voluntarily come to the companies, they would not be hired by them. The claimants have refrained from considering this as an input restriction, an input foreclosure, in the sense that the arguments are more overwhelming under the output foreclosure.
Yes, I have a question. How should we understand this agreement, this no-poach agreement? Is there as you are the claimant, is there a link between the first agreement and do you submit that there is only one infringement which covers the two agreements, or are there two separate agreements? So this is my first question. And then I noticed that as regards the fines, you are asking on order that the fine will be imposed, that it concerns only the, if I have understood correctly, the first agreement. Does it mean that from your perspective that this no-poach agreement is less serious than the first agreement?
Thank you for your question, Your Lordship. Regarding your first question, may I be right to assume that you were considering this under the ancillary restraint doctrine?
Well, my question is, perhaps you do not, is there only one infringement or two infringements? And are there any links between the two infringements or the two agreements?
As a preliminary issue, may I ask the court for extra time to answer the two submissions?
Yeah.
Thank you. Your question then therefore concerns whether it's one main agreement, one main infringement, or whether the no poach and the main agreement is two separate infringements. The claimants submit that the main agreement is certainly very harmful. This concerns the output restriction of the wind turbines. In that regard, it can be considered as ancillary, the no poach can be considered as ancillary, but the object of the no poach agreement is to combat industrial espionage and litigation costs. While this is certainly an issue, it should be analysed separately under 101.3 rather than under the 101.1 as where we are combining that analysing under 111 would therefore be considering it as one whole infringement. The claimants admit that it should be separate under 111 and 113.
One or two infringements? Two. So up to you, there are two infringements. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. With regard to the third point concerning the fact that it does not fulfill the criteria of 113, these are cumulative and exhaustive criteria. So I will begin with one of the criteria, namely that it must result in a degree of efficiency. There's a profound loss of efficiency, as has been established before, both to the firm and to the employees themselves. Moreover, there is an elimination of competition in the market. With this regard, I refrain from considering the last two conditions, as it is overwhelming that the conditions cannot be fulfilled under 1013. If the court has no further questions, I would like to proceed to the second submission.
If you agree with us that the infringement related to the non-poaching agreement is arguably less clear-cut, would you also agree that the burden of demonstrating justifications under 1013 is less burdensome for the defendants here?
Thank you for your question, Your Lordship.
That is, if the judgment on the no poaching rule is a closer decision, more ambiguous than, say, the agreement with respect to the turbines. If it's more ambiguous, aren't the defendants under a lesser burden to rebut under 1013 than they would be, say, for the turbine agreement?
This is a question primarily based on legal precedent. Concerning the output restriction and the wind turbines, there's much more case law there in that regard. And the higher threshold that has been established there can be based on these number of cases. So in that regard, it could be considered that the defendants have a lower burden of proof concerning the no poach agreement. However, that is not to say that they do not have the burden of proof. They must prove that it fulfills the criteria. And it's clear that there is a restriction of competition here. Now, whether it is under object or effect, it must be considered either way.
So you would agree with me, though, that their burden of demonstrating justifications might not be as robust as it would be for the turbine agreement?
The claimants don't find that there should be a distinction made here in the sense of how high the burden of proof is. It's merely a question of what is the legal basis that the burden of proof can be, what the legal basis is for the burden of proof. It's undeniable that they must rebut the arguments submitted by the claimants. Now, whether the court finds this to be a higher or lower burden of proof, the burden of proof still remains. Moreover, the pro and anti-competitive effects, as was highlighted in the European Night Services case, must be considered under 1013. The balancing there is the burden of proof is there clearly on the defendants rather than the claimant. Concerning the second issue of joint and several liability of power on RWP, this argument is also split up into three parts. Namely, the negative control that it holds over RWP, its veto right, and its sector know-how. Power on Horizon holds an overbearing negative control over RWP. Its 50% shareholding essentially forces the remaining shareholders to comply with its demands. The minority shareholders face a greater organizational challenge than Power On does. The minority shareholders cannot achieve a simple majority vote without Power On's favorable vote, whereas Power On can simply achieve a simple majority by aligning its vote with one other shareholder. Now, while this is individually cause for concern, when taken in combination with the fact that Power On holds the right to nominate a non-executive director, and that this non-executive director holds a veto right over the business plan, it can be established that there is a decisive influence of Power On over RWP. The business plan is key to the business. In Fuji, it was also held that there was a decisive influence between the parent and the subsidiary on the basis of management power exercised, on basis of factual evidence of management power, including the fact that the manager had to agree on issues relating to the creation of the joint venture. Now, the business plan is clearly part of the creation of a company and how it seeks to attain its goals. Now, the business plan is key in the beginning, but that does not mean to say that it is static. Moreover, in combination with the fact that since Power-On's investment in RWP has had the opportunity to develop significantly in the wind turbine sales market. Its know-how, therefore, has helped RWP develop its market. Power-On has a vested interest, both from a financial perspective, investor perspective, as well as a sector know-how perspective. The court has already established in the power cable, the Commission has established in the power cables decision, that an investor can also be held liable for its subsidiaries' conduct. The above arguments that I've raised concerning the negative control, the veto power that it holds, and the sector know-how that Power-On holds of the market is a clear indication that Power-On should be held jointly and severally liable for RWP's anti-competitive conduct. Power-On holds an overbearing negative control, and the remaining shareholders do not have the power to temper with Power-On. If I can be...
Can I ask whether you think it makes any difference whether Power-On would actually have had any ability to stop the company making this agreement in reality? With one executive director, if this agreement is made, it doesn't necessarily go to the board.
Thank you for your question, Your Ladyship. The fact that Power-On holds a veto right, and if I understand your question correctly, it's whether Power-On can influence the decisions made within the company.
Yeah, but does it make a difference whether it actually has behaved in such a way that it can exercise power, or whether in fact it is practicable to imagine that it could have exercised power to stop this?
Thank you for your question.
There's sort of two elements to it there. One is the general thing, was it actually active? The other question is, does that make a difference? But is it an essential to show that it was actually active, not merely had some powers that it didn't really use? And the second one is, does it make any difference if it didn't in fact have any power in practice to stop the company making this agreement, even assuming it was active?
It has been repeated many times in the court's case law that the decisive influence must have been exercised. This is for example in AEG Telefunken and Sassel. Power-On has exercised its veto right over the business plan. The decisive influence therefore can be proven to have been exercised over RWP. Moreover, in Sassel it was held that even the power to define or approve strategic commercial decisions can be held as basis for the decisive influence. So the fact that Power-On has this power and has exercised this decisive influence, and even though it's only a negative control, this is still indicative of a decisive influence.
That answers the first of my questions. What about the fact that even if it was quite active, if it couldn't in fact have stopped this agreement going ahead, is it right to punish it for failing to stop it? And if so, what factors would be relevant?
The attribution of liability between parent and subsidiaries is not based on the legal personality between the two entities. So whether Power-On in that sense is directly can be considered as the subsidiary is not relevant. This has been held in the AXO case, for example, that even if the economic unity consists of several persons, natural or legal, it can be considered as a single economic entity. If I can be of no further assistance to the court, the claimant submits its arguments.
That's fine. You're the defendants now.